What we're looking at today comes hard on the heels of one of the lowest points in Israel's history. In chapter 32, the chapter right before this, is the incident of their worshiping the golden calf. We looked at it in detail on Wednesday this morning. Let me just summarize what has happened. Moses is up on Mount Sinai for 40 days, getting instructions from God about how Israel is to walk with him as his covenant people. He's received instructions for this amazing new building that they're going to make, portable sanctuary called the tabernacle, its service, the priesthood, what the priests wear, how they conduct their service there in the tabernacle. And as Moses has been 40 days up on the mountain, Israel is camped there, waiting for him to return. But after about a month, they start to get anxious, and they wonder when he's coming back. You know, reading this over a span of several weeks as we are working our way through the book of Exodus, it's easy for us to lose track of what's been happening. If we were to just sit down and read it in a single setting, so much of this would hang together better. And so what I need to do this morning as we begin is pause and hope everybody's on the same page. Let's try to picture the scene that's before us. Israel is spread out across thousands of acres at the foot of Mount Sinai. Towering above them is the mount, and sitting on the summit of the mountain is a swirling cloud like thick smoke, signifying God's presence. There are occasional flashes of lightning that tear through that cloud, and then comes the deep rumbling of thunder that shakes the ground. And we've read that the people were terrified at this experience of the manifest presence of God. It terrified them at first. But as it went on day after day, they got used to it, and it became routine. So the people start to get antsy. They're eager to get on with the journey to that land of milk and honey that Moses said that he would lead them to. But their question is, well, where is he? Maybe he got hit by one of those bolts of lightning that we see flashing up there. And so they went to Moses' older brother Aaron, and they say, we don't know what's happened to this Moses cat. Make us gods that we can worship. Make us an idol. And so he did. He made them an idol fashioned after the main deity that had been worshipped by the Egyptians in the region they had lived when they were slaves in Egypt. That deity was named Apis. Its idol was in the shape of a young bull, a calf, symbolizing strength and fertility. And once it's made, the people began to rejoice. And seeing how delighted they were at what he had done, Aaron then went on and added to it. He made an altar, and he announced a special day of dedication for the idol. And when the day dawned, the people rose early, and they began to party. They ate and they drank. And after the drinking, a lot of times comes licentiousness, and it ended up becoming a drunken orgy around the golden calf. And while they're in the height of their partying, Moses returns to the camp. Here he comes. Now picture it. Can you see this down on the plain? There they are, dancing and jumping and just hideous stuff going on. And the noise of their celebration, it says that Moses and Joshua, as they were coming down the mount, they heard the people shouting. It sounds like war. No, that's not the sound of fighting we hear. It's the sound of people rejoicing. And here comes Moses. Now you tell me, what's Moses carrying? You saw the movie. What's Moses carrying? What's Charlton Heston carrying? I mean, Moses carrying. Right? He's got those stone tablets written with the very finger of God with the 10 Commandments on them. And he's returning to this scene of debauchery. When he takes those stone tablets, it says he shatters them, the mountain. Why? Well, because everything they were doing was shattering the Ten Commandments. He hurls down the commandments, shatters them, and then Moses goes to town on the golden calf. The worst of the idolaters were executed, and after a little family meeting with Aaron, Moses says, I'm going to go back up the mountain now, and I'm going to find out what God wants to do with y'all. I'm going to plead that God will forgive you and give you another chance, but I need to go meet with God. And so he goes back up the mountain, and that brings us to verse 1 of chapter 33. Look at it again. Then the Lord said to Moses, depart, go up from here, you and the people whom you have brought out of the land of Egypt, to the land of which I swore to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, saying, to your descendants I will give it, and I will send my angel before you. I'll drive out the Canaanite, the Amorite, Hittite, Perizzite, Hivite, Jebusite. Go up to a land flowing with milk and honey, and now, folks, catch this. Don't miss this, because this is the main point of this whole passage and the message today. I will not go up in your midst, lest I consume you on the way, for you are a stiff-necked people. In light of what's just happened, God tells Moses he is not going to dwell in Israel's midst any longer. Yes, he will guide them to Canaan as he has promised, but he says he's going to go before them, not with them. Friends, God always keeps his promises. He had promised Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob that Canaan would be their land forever. And so he says, yes, I will lead your descendants back there. I made a promise. I always keep my promise. But this whole distraction with the golden calf had revealed something crucial about the people of Israel. They were waywardly stubborn. Notice that God diagnoses them here as being stiff-necked. That didn't mean that they had slept wrong and needed a chiropractor. The term describes an ox that refuses to turn when it's directed. If you've ever ridden a horse, you have a sense of this, a feel for what's going on. You control a horse by the reins. If you loosen the reins, it means horse go faster. When you want it to slow down, you pull back on the reins evenly, both at the same time, and the horse feels its head pull back because of the bit in its mouth. It knows that it needs to slow down. When you want it to stop, you pull hard, and it's like putting on the brakes, and the horse will stop. If you want it to go right, you pull on the right rein, the horse's head turns to the right and knows you want to go to the right. To the left, the other way. Now listen, here's the thing. If you're not used to riding a horse, you get up there, that's a huge beast. It can be rather intimidating. How many of you have ever ridden a horse? Let me see your hands. Okay, so you know what I'm talking about. If you get on that horse, it can be intimidating. Horses are not dumb. Horses are smart. And there are many horses, when a new rider gets on their back, they want to know, does this rider know what they're doing? And so a lot of times they will resist the control of the rider. And so you'll pull on that right rein, wanting to go right, and it's thinking, I wonder if this rider really knows what it wants. I wonder if it knows it's really in control of me, or how much control I have. And sometimes that horse, it'll resist. It'll pull back a little bit. It'll say, I want to go back where there's hay, and it'll just take off. You're like, whoa. You gotta let that horse know, I'm in control. Well, every so often a farmer will find an ox who won't turn where he directs it. There's a yoke on that ox's neck, and there are reins on that yoke, and the way that the yoke turns is the direction that the ox is to go. Also, to make it go forward, the farmer has a little thing called a goad. It's a long stick with a point on the end of it, and it'll just tap the flank of the ox to get it to go. If the ox doesn't go, it gets a little bit more of a poke. And the idea is you need to follow the direction of the the farmer. Well, sometimes farmers will find an ox that's just stubborn. And though the yoke is telling it to turn this way or that, it just stiffens its neck and says, no, I refuse to take direction. Now, do you know what a farmer does with an ox that simply won't take direction? That's where beef jerky comes from. Israel was like a willful and wayward ox that refused to heed God. But he doesn't want to wipe them out, which is what will happen if he, in his holiness, dwells in their highly unholy midst. And so he says he's going to send his angel before them to lead them to Canaan, but he will no longer be with them. Verse 4. And when the people heard this bad news, they mourned, and no one put on his ornaments. So Moses comes down the hill now with this word from God, and he reports it to the people, and when they hear it, they recognize it for what it is. It's bad news. Folks, listen to me. It's bad news when God says, I'm not going to be with you anymore. And they recognized it as such. They were so bummed up. They stopped dressing up. That's remarkable. Before the Exodus, they had been slaves. And as slaves, they had no wealth. They didn't have any jewelry. They had no fancy clothes. They were slaves. But when it came time to leave, you'll remember that the Egyptian people had loaded them up with massive amounts of treasure because they recognized that their God was powerful. And in their attempt to stop the devastation of their land, they said, let's bless the people that God is blessing. And it says they heaped them up, loaded them up with gold and gems and silver and treasure and fancy clothes. Well, as is often the case with people who have not had wealth, they overdid it now by lavishing it on themselves. They began dressing up and loading themselves down with ostentatious displays of gold and gems. Chapter 32 tells us that when Aaron made the golden calf, he made it only from the golden earrings that they had all started to wear. He says, bring me your golden earrings. And that's what he had made the golden calf out of. But when they get the news that God's presence is being withdrawn, they're struck by how silly these attempts to pretend they were rich were. Were it not for God, they would still be all slaves back in Egypt. They ought to have been loyal to him for all that he had done. But instead they had shown the utmost disregard for him by ignoring the very first 2 commandments on that list of 10. The first 2 they've broken. What was it? Have no gods but God, and make no idols. They've shattered, destroyed, completely ruined the very first 2 commandments. So now, dressed up in their fancy duds and their lavish jewelry, they feel like the guy at the funeral who shows up and everybody else is mourning in black and he's wearing a bright green and red floral print shirt. What are we doing? This is wrong. It isn't until they hear that God's presence will be withdrawn they realize how all-important his presence was. It's true. You don't know what you got till it's gone. You pave paradise and put up a parking lot. That's what they've done. A land flowing with milk and honey is great. Freedom and prosperity are wonderful, but they mean nothing if God is not in them. There's an important, dare I say, all-important truth for us to glean from this. But to do so, we really do need to stand with those people on that plain at the foot of that mount. I want to ask you, please, don't just read this as some ancient story. All of us need to put ourselves on that plain there at the foot of that mount, seeing Moses standing on the side of that hill. Please understand, put yourself there. Look a little higher and see that cloud swirling up there, knowing that's the manifest presence of God. See yourself standing with all of these people that have just royally blown it. And see this man who's standing there in front of you announcing God's counsel and word to you. You remember that just a few weeks before this, you yourself have heard the very voice of God. You heard him speak those 10 commandments. You heard them with your own ears. And then you heard God say, if you will be my people, I will be your God. And I will bless you more than any people that have ever lived or ever will live, if you will simply come into covenant with me. And what do the people say? We do. Think of it, just like a wedding. God says, I do to the people, and they say, I do to him. And now, during their honeymoon, they're already committing adultery, which is precisely what the Bible calls idolatry. It is spiritual adultery. So God says, I'm going to keep my vow. And yes, I will carry you across the threshold into the house that I promised you. But I will not live there with you. And you suddenly realize, what good is the house if God doesn't live there? What's the point of being married if there's no fellowship between the spouses? Friends, what was true for them is true for us. The gospel is the good news that Jesus restores fellowship between God and man by removing the barrier of sin. Christianity is not churchianity. We aren't called to a religion. We are called to a relationship with God through faith in Jesus Christ. And that relationship is all about having his presence in our lives. And if it's not that, it is nothing. There's a poignant reminder of this in the very last book of the Bible. Jesus sent a letter to a church at a city called Laodicea. You'll find it in Revelation chapter 3. This was a prosperous church. This church was doing really well. They were successful. As far as how they were doing church, they were top of their game. They were on the cover of Cool Church Quarterly. And they really did. They thought they were all that. But Jesus says that he's not even in their church. He had left. He had left their church. There are some famous words that many people have heard before. You ever heard the phrase where Jesus says, "Behold, I stand at the door and knock"? It was to the church of Laodicea he said that. If he's knocking on the door, where is he? Inside or outside? He's outside. He sends a letter to a church and he goes, "Folks, I left." And you don't even know it. How sad when a church doesn't know that Jesus left. At least here in ancient Israel, they had the sense to mourn when they heard that God was departing. He doesn't leave without a warning. Proof of it is here in chapter 33. And in another letter that Jesus sent that we find in Revelation chapter 2. This time to the church at Ephesus. Listen to me. Jesus commended them for their devotion and their doctrinal purity. He was pleased by all the hard work that they were engaged in, all of the good that they did. But he set all of it aside and he warned them, "I'm about to leave your church." All because they had forsaken their first love. Simple adoration and fellowship with him. They had allowed their relationship with God to decay to mere religion, in which they understood as being busy and being right. I fear that Calvary Chapel of Oxnard could easily come down with Ephesian syndrome. That we'd assume that because we have a full calendar and because we're devoted to the truth, we're safe. Jesus commended the Ephesians for all of that, but he still warned them that The why for what they were doing was missing. If they didn't return to that why, he says, I'm leaving. Jesus will not stick around a loveless church or a loveless life. Well, let's see what God's warning to Israel did. Let's look here, verse 7. Moses took his tent and pitched it outside the camp, far from the camp, and called it the tabernacle of meeting. And it came to pass that everyone who sought the Lord went out to the tabernacle of meeting, which was outside the camp. God does leave their midst, but he doesn't go far. Moses set up a place where those who remained loyal to God could still meet with him, and they did. But they had to leave the camp to get there. It was a bit of a hike, but they made it. Let me end with this morning. Please hear me as we end. God always has his faithful remnant. The majority who call themselves God's people may in fact be pretenders, adept posers who know how to play the religious game. But God always has his real deal sons and daughters. And sometimes they have to go out of poser camp to meet him. When Jesus leaves the loveless church of Ephesus and it becomes the empty religious club of Laodicea, the people of God need to go outside to the tent of meeting. And may I say, that really is the story of church history, isn't it? Of God's real people rising up and calling where they are to reformation and to change and to come back to the Lord. And if that church won't, they leave and they start something new. Friends, here we are at the big wrap-up of the ages. Time is short, and things are going to escalate rapidly toward the end in Jesus' return. Our community desperately needs Calvary Chapel of Oxnard to be a tent of meeting, not poser camp. Let's keep it all about Jesus, loving him and basking in his great love for us. May we never lose the centrality that it's all about Jesus and our relationship with him. Having a full calendar, having a lot of activities is not what it's about. If Jesus is not here, we should all just go someplace else. And what I say to you and call us to as a church, it has to begin with me. And for you, it has to begin with you. Is Jesus, is the Lord here?